Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started on Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. There are some printouts in the back in case those are helpful for you to read and take some notes. I have so enjoyed the Psalm study that we've been doing this summer. It's not frequent that we're able to get almost every service to make some reference to a joint theme. So whether it's been singing or the prayers or whatever, doing that together to me has been really impactful. And I appreciate everyone's focus to make that happen and all the planning. It's not a simple task to coordinate things well. So appreciate that. Tonight we're going to look at Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. 15 especially is very short. There is a great deal of overlap between them. So a couple things I'd like you to think about as we're reading is, where are they the same? Are there places that they're different? And how would we think about that? But especially pay attention to the structure, because I think in both of them, the structure really helps us understand what the psalmist wants us to hear and to see. So we'll start by reading Psalm 15, and then we'll discuss it a little bit. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth in his heart, who does not slander with his tongue and does no evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord, who swears to his own hurt and does not change, who does not put out his money at interest and does not take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. So take a second and make a few notes. I think there's at least one structural thing you can take note of. Hopefully you'll see some more than that. And then also just think about the character of the person who's being described here. Two thoughts for you to consider. All right, so if you're going to think about the most simplistic way you could describe the structure of this psalm, what would that be?
Question and answer.
Yeah, Michelle said the exact same thing. It's a question followed by an answer or answers, plural, depending on how you think about it, right? Is that one answer, or is it no, I think it's one question. I think it's one question twice. Who shall I really struggle saying who shall sojourn. That's hard. Who shall sojourn with Sally selling seashells by the seashore in your tent, and who shall dwell on your holy hill? So what's this question mean? What is the question that David really wants to understand? Because he's not actually planning to go live on a hill. He's not actually trying to go live in a tent. Joshua?
It's who can be in the presence of the Lord? Who can be with the Lord?
Yeah, so he is using the ideas of a hill or a tent. One, a hill, because frequently in that time, they would go up onto a hill or a high place to do sacrifices. Sometimes the Israelites really mess that up and they put a bunch of pagan stuff on the high places. That's no good. It's not what he's talking about. Or to go to his tent, right? And that makes a lot of sense if you think about when this is written, because this is pre-temple, right? And so to dwell in the presence of the Lord, the closest thing that they could think of at that time would be dwelling in the tabernacle, right? And so that's the same idea. How can we be in the presence of the Lord? All right, and now there's this whole list. So what are the things that we see in the list that are an answer to this question?
One thing I noticed, this might not answer your question, but
Great.
I noticed is there's a lot of nots in here. There are things that you're not to do and things that you are to do, but at the end it says do these things. Well, not doing something is not doing these things, but it's kind of contrary.
So he's providing, I think he's giving more information than just saying, do this. He's making really clear that there are things that we have to do in order to dwell with the Lord, but there are also things that we have to cast off or not do in order to be with the Lord. You don't get to do lots and lots of good things, but have an evil heart, right? I think you really see that in verse 2. He has to walk blamelessly, does what is right, and speaks truth in his heart. So he kind of gives these three different facets of what righteousness could look like. And it's how do you conduct yourself? What things do you do? And is there truth in your heart? Because it is possible to do what is right and have an evil heart. And it is possible to do things that are wrong, but maybe not be quite as evil as some people who are doing right. And that's actually a concept or a principle that's important for us, is that we don't have to be perfect. That we're seeking for our hearts to align to the Father. We're seeking for our actions to align to the Father. But I can't actually achieve perfection, and so how do I do that? What else do you see here? Michael?
To that point, it is kind of perfect choice, though, in that it's not he who occasionally slanders, but mostly doesn't slander. It's very binary.
Yeah.
This person does not do that.
Yeah, on the applications or like summary points that I have, my first one is that this seems really, really hard. It's a very high bar. It encompasses actions and thoughts and our tongue. It talks about money. Basically, every facet of our life gives the idea that we need to be perfect in order to dwell with God. David Lee?
Verse 4 summarizes that, where he says, in whose eyes a vile person is despised, or the net reads, he despises a reprobate. It's not, he tolerates it, he kind of toes the line, gets as close as he can without crossing it. It's like, no, he sees the evil and despises it and wants nothing to do with it.
Yeah, verse 4 to me is super poignant as we are in an election season. He despises a vile person. He honors those who fear the Lord and swears to his own hurt and does not change. Meaning, when he makes a promise, he does the thing he's going to do even if it hurts him. I think it is very difficult to me when Christians become involved in the political world, because it is very easy to get really close to supporting vile people or outright supporting them. And I don't want to pick a fight when I say this. Hopefully I won't. But I think as Christians, we need to really evaluate if we are going to support people like Donald Trump and say, are we going to vocally support someone who does vile, evil, despicable things and talks about them openly? And what does that look like to other people when we do that? Does he match who we are? And if he doesn't, what does it mean when we support him or other politicians? Not just trying to say one politician, but when we align ourselves to someone in the world, and especially align in ways that can create fights and problems and people will form perceptions about us, we need to really think about what we are standing up for when we stand up for things that aren't the Bible. But because here, the person who gets to dwell in the tent is the one who despises the evil person, who honors the one who fears the Lord and keeps promises. That is not the description of most politicians I'm aware of, sadly. Well, and that's why I'm not getting into should we vote or not vote. No, I didn't. I talked about who we support and if we're going to be vocal about it.
Yeah.
And
It's who you support. Because if you would any politician be your friend, no, that would be hard.
none, very few.
But if they were your friend, you associate with them, so what they do associates back to you.
Yeah, and I brought it up to not necessarily to say do vote, don't vote, any of that, but more to say if we are extremely vocal about anything that is not the Bible, we have opened ourselves up to attention that may be problematic here. David, and then we're going to go on.
Just kind of zooming out on this, verses 3 through 5, kind of lists all these things, kind of zooming out on kind of the big picture of what I see in those verses. Verse 3 lists all these things up. Don't slay your neighbor, not being evil to his neighbor. That kind of comes as, okay, I'm acting with integrity towards the people around me. And in the first part of verse 4, to me kind of reads like, and I have the right perception of the people around me. Like, my values are in the right place. I'm valuing the right things. I'm not going to kind of my wires crossed like what is good or bad. And then kind of the end of verse 4 into verse 5 is kind of this idea of somebody who puts integrity over their own profit. That is, they're going to seek to do the thing that is honest and just and fair over the thing that is going to necessarily benefit them or make them the most money, I guess. And even the idea of, like, does not put out his money as interest. Like, that's kind of an interesting concept. I think I wouldn't say that's like necessarily a one-to-one to like our current economic business model, I guess. But that's an interesting idea of somebody who's not necessarily looking to make money, even if there's potentially an honest way to do that, if that's going to come at the expense of somebody else unduly, I guess. So like, who's somebody who has their priorities in the right place, who's interacting with other people in a way that is gracious and full of character towards them, even if that is a high bar, even maybe what we might consider unnecessary.
Yeah, so one comment about the dealing with money, putting money out at interest. If you think back to the law, the main concept that this is related to is if someone is poor, they can't take care of their family, they need to sell their land. They can't sell their land. That's not something that they could do. But because every 50 years, it's supposed to come back in the year of Jubilee to their family, right? And so what the law made provision for was, if I'm hard up and Alan says, well, Adam, I'll help you, he can take my land. Essentially, he can lease it from me, is the language we would use. But he can only lease it from me for the amount of money that it could reasonably make in those seasons that are left between then and the year of Jubilee. So he could not say, well, it would get 45 seasons, but I'm going to charge you an 8% interest. So, when you compound that, I'm actually going to charge, you can only have 30 seasons worth of money. He actually has to give the money to me without that concept of interest and for a reasonable expectation for the yield of the land. And in this way, the rich could not harm the poor by essentially taking from them, but putting such laborious terms on top of them that they could never get out of this situation. And I love the way you talked about this in terms of the character here at the end really talks about my character is worth more than whatever money I could get if I sacrificed my character. If I swear, if I promise to do something, even if that ends up being a raw deal for me at the end of the day, I still do it. I don't say, well, I didn't really understand the deal I was making. Or if you fast forward to Matthew, well, I didn't swear on the temple, so I guess we'll just, forget it. And then also does not take a bribe against the innocent. Again, this is the idea of there's someone who has power Someone else maybe wants their land, and they come and they say, hey, judge, I'm going to slip you a little something so that you will let me take their land from them, like a Naboth's vineyard sort of situation, right? But all these things are descriptions of how someone has power or ability potentially to benefit, and they forego that because their character is of such high caliber that they can't allow themselves to. Mike?
Looking at this from, like, if you look at verse 1, the questions, and then the end of verse 5. So, who can dwell in the presence of the Lord? And he who does these things shall never be moved. And I don't want to dive into too deep. This is actually part of my talk in a little while. But the idea there of, if you were to say this, like, you see some situation, and you're like, oh, that's horrible, but you don't know what you would do in that situation. Like, you've not been there, so you don't know what you would do in that situation. That idea that this person would never be moved who does these things, because what they value is to dwell in the presence of the Lord, and it doesn't matter the situation. This type of person who walks this way has invested their life to being in the presence and desiring to be in the presence of the Lord, and that's reflected through these things. These are qualities that are demonstrated by God and Jesus, that if we demonstrate those same qualities, we, just like Jesus would never be moved, we would never be moved. It's not really that idea.
Yeah. Well, that makes me think of Ephesians 4 and the discussions we've had of late about maturity. Someone who's not tossed to and fro, that they're steady, that this person's character and the decisions that they've made and that they're choosing to make are so steady and consistent that they are essentially immovable from the presence of the Lord.
And they can discern good from evil.
Yes, absolutely. There's lots of things here that would tell you they can discern good from evil. David Lee?
I counted 12 either do or don't do things in this passage, and from my count, 6 of them have something to do with honesty of some form. There was just kind of a summarization of the last few comments of like the person that's unmovable in God's house. Honesty, there's a premium on honesty as far as that person's concerned.
Well, and I think something that's interesting in here, some of these things are evident easily, right? If you put your money out at interest, people know that. That's an action that you've done that's seeable. If you take a bribe, it's potentially a little noble. But then there's also things in here that maybe aren't really so knowable. Like, he doesn't slander with his tongue. So I don't say bad things about other people in any setting. I don't take up a reproach against my friend. That's essentially, I don't have hatred towards my friend. Like, people don't necessarily know that, right? So there's things here that are outward actions and also inward actions, if you'll go with that are difficult maybe for us to perceive in every way. So the one who dwells with the Lord is complete in their righteousness, and they're seeking to be holy in that they are consistent both inwardly and outwardly. Any more comments before we go on to Psalm 24?
A lot to do with speech. There's a lot of things here that talk about the way you talk.
Yeah, I think like a third of them deal with something related to speech. Yeah. All right, let's do the same thing for Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Selah. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. Selah. All right, take a moment and make a couple notes. There's some structural differences between these two, even though the overall message is almost the same. I think they're interesting to take note of. All right. What'd you notice about the structure of this one? How is it similar?
Verse 3 matches verse 1 almost.
Yeah, so the primary question is very similar, or almost the same. But Psalm 24 has a second question. What's the second question? What'd you say, Wayne? Yeah, who is the King of glory? And it doesn't just show up once, it shows up twice in verse 8 and verse 10. And then the other structural difference that I saw, at least, was there's almost like an intro to the idea here that the psalmist gives this praise to the Lord about the earth being his, that everything that dwell in the earth is his. He's the founder and he established it. So he's in a way lifting up the Lord even more than Psalm 15, because he's now kind of reestablishing the regal stature or the deity of God and his power, and then saying, well, who can join him? What will we have to do to be like him? So what's the answer? What do we have to be like in order to dwell with him?
Clean hands, pure heart.
Say it louder, Alan.
Clean hands, pure heart.
Yeah, so you have to have both. You can't just have clean hands, and you can't just have a pure heart. I think it's arguable you can't have a pure heart if you don't have clean hands, but you have to have both either way. So you have to have, in our family we say kind hands, kind feet, kind words. Way more than I ever thought I would say something like that. These boys, man, they're different than raising girls. I'm sorry, you folks that just have only had girls so far and you're about to have boys. It's different. Just telling you. But you can't just do what's right. You have to have it in your heart. What else? What other things do you see about the character of the one that can join the Lord on the holy hill?
I think verse 6 where it says, those who seek him and those who seek the face of God, that's it's the sort of the centerpiece of this psalm. And in Jewish literature, the center piece is usually very important. And so, as you were saying in Psalm 15, it's not really about being this perfect person, even though it's describing perfection, and we know that that in some ways is not attainable. It is sort of about being oriented towards the Lord. And so you always attain for that perfection. But are you turned towards God? Are you seeking Him? Or are you just like casually doing good because maybe it'll make you look nice? Those are very different things, even though they may look the same.
Yeah. Depending on the time and the place, it can be fashionable to be kind or to be nice or whatever. Melissa?
To me, there's a contrast between this vile person who's despised and having clean hands and a pure heart. And when you think about it, we're all vile in God's eyes. We're all sinners. We've all disobeyed His word. But because of this King of Glory, we can have clean hands and a pure heart.
Is it Michael?
That's verse 5. This is it right there. You would think that this person's already righteous.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need to receive righteousness. But verse 5, he will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. So, I mean, it's both of those comments right there. It's not about being perfect. It's aiming towards God, and He will grant you righteousness.
Right. Yeah, so I think that I agree that seeking the Lord is kind of almost the crescendo of this psalm. It's all building up to there, and then it kind of reaches this high spot that we're going to talk about with the King of Glory. But the important thing here is that we will receive blessing and righteousness. That the one who attains to being on the holy hill, the righteousness that gets them there is not attained through their own perfection. He blesses them with that righteousness in verse 5. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just comparing the two and kind of adding on to what they said. Psalm 15 is talking about what we need to do to receive this, and then Psalm 24 is just saying how God's going to give it to us, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And to add on to what they said, let me see how they said this. When you were first born, you had nothing to do with it. And your spiritual birth that God gives to you, again, you have to, He's not going to give it to you, you have to seek it. But in the end, you still have nothing to do with it. It's not from your own power. God's given it to you.
Right. Yeah, it's in the seeking is where He blesses us with it. Yeah, great point. And so the first question, who can ascend the hill of the Lord? We've kind of answered that. It's not just those who are perfect. It is those who are blessed with righteousness, not of their own accord, but from the hand of God. And then the psalm goes on, and Melissa hinted at this, to explain how that happens. And now we reach very much the high point of the psalm with this King of Glory. So I have a feeling that most of us all have the same idea about what this is talking about. Maybe. What would y'all say this is talking about? What are the last 5 verses of this psalm immediately make you think of?
Going to heaven. To me, going to heaven and spending time with the Lord.
That's interesting. That's not what I was going to say. I was thinking messianic.
Christ?
Yeah, to me, this is like the triumphal entry, right? What were you going to say?
Is it end of Ezekiel, where it's the temple and the vision, which is very Revelation, but this whole psalm feels very elemental to me.
Yeah.
It goes with the earth, and then the seas, and the rivers, and then the who shall stand in this holy place? That's fire for the burning bush when Moses, and then the hill, and then okay, let's lead up to heaven.
Yeah. Leads up to the temple, to heaven. Yeah. And when we see things like O gates, O ancient doors, the King of glory is going to come in. Lift up your heads. That, to me, just cries out about the triumphal entry of Christ into Jerusalem. That basically the city, he conquered the city without bloodshed, without the sword, without any fighting, but seated on a colt and with people making certain that his animal, that the animal's feet didn't even touch the cobblestones. They're laying down palm fronds on the street so that the way for even the animal is easier in giving him honor. That when the King of Glory comes, the resulting fight, if you want to think about it that way, because they use these words like strong and mighty, mighty in battle, that gives you the idea that there's going to be this fight. But then he gives the contrast here that no fight actually happens. So imagine all those times that Jerusalem was under siege. What did they do when they were under siege?
Close the gates.
Close up the gates, shut the doors, everything's barred, no one can get in, and it takes days, weeks, months of siege in order to break through. And that's the normal way that a general is greeted when he comes to a city, is with a closed door. But when the King of Glory comes, how is he greeted? No one puts up a fight. It's actually the opposite. He's welcomed into the city and not fought as he comes in. Great. What else do y'all see, Michael?
I like interesting. And then if you think of verses 3 and 4, you think about it like maybe as messianic. As Jesus had to ascend the holy hill of God to go enter into Jerusalem, he had to make that trek up there. And he does already have these things. He has a clean heart. He has a clean hands, a pure heart. He's completely perfect. So, I like that.
Kelly?
I was thinking, instead of, you kind of contrasted how a king or a king would come to a city and be closely. When I read it, I thought of the king coming back from battle and being praised
Oh.
by, I can see.
Almost like the Roman general or Caesar marching through Rome
Right,
with.
I'm sure David went to battle and came back the same way and was praised because they had
Right.
won it. And so it's like they're praising the king for this mighty conquering that he just accomplished. Except in this case, it's God himself.
That's interesting. I like that. And, we know David did that because that's when Saul had one of his biggest outbursts. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. David really could have been all right if they hadn't said that. That didn't. Jealousy just wasn't a good thing with Saul. Brian?
Like your analogy of messianic, I just also read this. Two things. One, as both Psalms mention, I think the simplifying the source of this, it says pure heart, tied to Jesus, and the attitude of God, blessed the pure heart, they shall see God. So Jesus explained who's going to see God, there's a pure heart. And as we talk about the character and qualities of speech and so forth, we know that from the heart, what comes out of us, we have our speech. So the source of our speech, the source of our attitudes, the source of our thinking is from the heart, the pure heart.
Yeah.
And then to answer your thoughts on 7:13, I think I like it out in Ezekiel when it says, lift them up, O ancient doors. This is talking about something of old in the past. God's reward will heal the leaves. He said, there will be a time when I shall call my people, and I will be their God. And I will come back, and we'll get together again. So the ancient doors lift up, we'll be dwell together.
Yeah, so the gates here and the doors, lift up your heads, O gates, lift them up, O ancient doors. These are inanimate objects, right? This is like when you read that the stones cry out at the glory of God. That a big part in prophecy as you read through it is dealing with the glory of God is so magnificent that even inanimate, dead objects will find a way to praise Him. That His glory is so great that even stones can cry out. Well, here, this is the same thing. Lift up your heads, O gates. Well, gates don't have heads to lift up exactly. He is ascribing a human action to an inanimate object, and this is a way of really showing that the glory of this king is so wonderful that even the gates just realize, well, we should just open. That's just what we should do now because the King of Glory is coming. Even dead things can see who He is and what He's going to do. Yes, sir.
Something that I like is verse 3, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And then verse 9, it says, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of Glory may come in. It's kind of, we're ascending to Him, but He's also coming in at the same time. So we're meeting in the middle, I guess you could say. It's not just, we have to go all the way because we can't go all the way without Him. He has to come to us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. What else do y'all see here? David?
Kind of interesting to think about this within the context of our First Samuel class as well, and the contrast between Saul as a king, David as a king.
You're probably making Michael's point. He was probably going to say this. I'm just
Which is, it's hard to see Saul ever writing a psalm like this. This psalm is constantly ascribing authority to God instead of David, who is the literal king. He starts off by saying, the whole earth is God's, which is very different from what you would expect an earthly king to say, which is kind of like, yeah, all this land is mine. And then he ends by saying, who is this King of Glory? And you might expect him to be able to, well, it's David, right? He's the king of Israel. He's the king. He's God's anointed. And David then again describes that title of King of Glory to God, which it's this mindset of almost like David perceives himself, I think, implicitly as a steward, that everything that he is ruling over really belongs to God. In contrast to the way that we're seeing Saul rule in First Samuel class, which is he wants the power, he wants the glory, he wants to be the king. And the reason that David is the king is because David knows that God is the actual king.
Yeah, so when he answers this question himself, who is the King of Glory? And then he tells us who it is. It's the Lord of hosts. So my question for you is, when he wrote this, who did they think the Lord of hosts was? What'd you say?
Who's that?
Well, so David is writing this psalm ostensibly for himself / the Jews. I think we now see it as a messianic psalm. I don't know if they necessarily saw it that way. But when it talks about this King of Glory, strong and mighty in battle, and then it says that he's the Lord of hosts, what do we think that meant to them? Is that God? Do they think of that as Christ? Callie?
When it says Lord, it would have said Yahweh there, right? So
I think so.
I think that.
I didn't go look at the Hebrew or the Aramaic or whatever.
I mean, I don't know that they saw it as messianic, but they definitely saw it as God.
Yeah. And so the reason I'm asking that question is because I kind of want us to think about that point. So it's really good that we see the Messiah so frequently in the Old Testament. That is helpful. But it's also helpful to think about when they read this psalm, maybe they were thinking about a future Messiah, potentially. But a lot of these things, they were thinking about it in relation to themselves and at that time. And so it is encouraging for us to read because we can think of things like, oh, the triumphal entry, and all these things happen with the Messiah. They likely saw this still as encouraging, still as hopeful, still they see that they are blessed from the Lord and they are blessed with his righteousness. But potentially they see this as a more present tense thing for them. That they weren't looking forward to something that would happen for others in the future. They were thinking potentially about it more as they were blessed with this Lord now who was mighty in battle. David Lee?
So with that, then, could you read verse 3 and 4 and 5 as who is allowed to ascend to the mountain of the Lord, not as who's allowed to go be in eternity with the Lord, but who is allowed to ascend up Jerusalem and worship the Lord? Like today, offer my sacrifices and offer up praise and worship the Lord.
Yeah.
Because we have the song of the ascents that we did a few weeks ago.
Yeah. So they have this concept that when they approach the Lord, they have to approach in holiness. That's what all of that sacrifice is that happens as for the Day of Atonement, is to make it possible. Like they make more and more sacrifices for everyone, and then the high priest makes a sacrifice just for himself. All that is solely so he can represent the people in front of the Lord.
Question. So if their concept was we have to worship the Lord in holiness, so in order to come in, we have to be holy. Do we have the same concept now? Does that still apply? Or is it more of a I come a sinner, I come broken, I come with everything that is like wrong with me, and that's how I come to God, and then the holiness is like granted upon me, or is it some combination thereof? Is it both at the same time but different?
It's an interesting thought question. A couple thoughts I have on that are, one, I believe that we need to come acknowledging our sinfulness when we come to worship. And acknowledging that his sacrifice makes it possible for us to ultimately enter his presence, which that is our goal in worship, is to enter his presence and give him praise. So I think in the same way that they needed sacrifice, we need sacrifice. Michael, you have a thought?
I think sometimes when we go so far down the I'm a sinner, obviously without God we are a sinner, but let's talk about with God sometimes
Yes.
too, that we are holy because he's made us holy, so we come here holy.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes we almost diminish God's power, and we don't speak those things because we're just still afraid of what we really are without him.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And that's why I was a little hesitant actually to say it, is I think we can. Paul gave us a great example when he said, I've run the race, I've finished the race. He talks about his surety of his salvation. And I am glad that at least here, this wasn't necessarily true when I was growing up, that we seem more willing to say that we're saved. I grew up with a lot of people that were, well, if the Lord wills, I'll be saved. I hope, maybe. That's not what he says. He says we're saved. Now, I get that we have to be humble in that, and that's what we're balancing here. Is we're not saved because of what we did. We're saved because of what he did, which is also what's present in this psalm, right? And so, as we approach the throne, as we seek the holy hill, our prayer is that he conveys righteousness on us, just like this psalm talks about. That's what enables us to worship him, is he allows us to. He blesses us to. He gives us the righteousness to be in his presence. Because otherwise, our worship would, be outside the tent, if that makes sense. Thank you so much for your comments, and we'll continue next week.